So, you want to develop and use a virtual memory palace, one based either purely on your imagination or with reference to a video game, a movie, perhaps a novel, a painting, maybe a painting within a painting. It's possible. And you know, the earliest example that I can think of someone doing this was during the medieval period when Hugh of St. Victor talked about using Noah's Ark as a memory palace. Not just one version, but 4. And scholars who have studied his work think that he had a painting of Noah's Ark behind him when he taught topics related to the Bible and then discussed using this imaginary Noah's Ark as a memory palace. Well, Hugh of St. Victor, he was a cool dude, but we have even more options than he did because we live in a world packed with all kinds of potential memory spaces that can serve as virtual memory palaces. Now, I'm going to share with you several examples beyond what Hugh of St. Victor has suggested or we think he was suggesting, and some of them are my own, some of them are references to other suggestions from other people. But there's something really, really important that we need to explore here, because the reason why you want to explore virtual memory palaces in the first place is not necessarily to use them as memory palaces to learn. Now, you can certainly experiment with that. But the real reason, in my view, and the reason why I'm talking about it in the first place, in such glorious depth, is that it's a great mental exercise. One that we can use to strengthen our ability to use memory palaces based on real locations. So, there's lots and lots of reasons to get this right, to understand it in some depth, and to make sure that we're reducing cognitive load rather than increasing it. Look, I'm not the policeman of cognitive load. If it doesn't create more mental strain for you to use artificial memory palaces based on virtual reality environments, which we'll talk about later, that's cool. But for a lot of us, and I've heard from many, many, many people over the years, it doesn't help minimize the cognitive load. It increases it. And so you do you, but I would encourage radical honesty about what's really going on in your practice and whether you're really getting things learned at the end of the day. And also accept, if you will, Metivier's razor, which states that less than 90 days of study and practice of almost any accelerated learning technique does not deserve the phrase, "I tried." Now, I don't want to sound arrogant here to name a rule like this after myself, but you only live once. And, if Occam can do it, why can't I? I'm not sure Occam named it himself. But the reason why I create these trainings in such depth and think things through to the nth degree is because I know that the magnetic memory method and my work is not for everyone. In fact, not everyone is ready for each and every video I put out there. So it may be helpful for you to know about the virtual way that I think through the different kinds of videos that I make. I make content that's designed to get you thinking differently. I make content designed to inspire action because you've thought differently. I make theoretical content, which quite frankly, most people need way more theory about mnemonics, memory palaces, and all kinds of memory techniques in order for the actions they take to produce fruits, especially when we're talking about virtual memory palaces, because it's probably not going to be useful overnight. It's probably not going to be useful for a while. Now, will it be 90 days? Will Metivier's razor be some magic number? I don't know, but we do know from memory science of habit formation and all kinds of psychological studies that 90 days is kind of lowballing it, but it is a bare minimum, and I make content that also helps you with implementation, specifically what to do and how to do it. And I happen to really like to rotate between all of these different content types in order to have a bit of variety in my own life. But this one is a little bit more on the theory end of things, and we do really need as much theory as we can get. And so, I need more theory. I always need more theory. I'm never going to stop needing theory because theory is one of the best ways to improve the actions that we take. And so if you pay attention to what I'm about to say about virtual memory palaces in this production. You're going to wind up with reasonably operable virtual memory palaces sooner than later. And not only that, it's going to strengthen how that you use memory palaces based on real locations, which I think is the ne plus ultra in my own practice, but I have benefited so much from what we're about to explore. So if you're ready for the deepest dive on virtual memory palaces that I'm aware of, and you're willing to keep Metivier's razor top of mind, get subscribed if you're new here. Hit that thumbs up for the love of memory so that we all together help those virtual robots who are deciding who sees what and when. And let's dive in with that thumbs up smashed hard, 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 hard. Not virtually smash the thumbs up, but really smash it, because it's time to mix it up. As I mentioned, there is a long history to the idea of a virtual memory palace or a mnemonic device based on a location you have not seen with your own eyes. If you're not able to see, because people without vision also use memory palaces, we're talking perhaps about using an area that you haven't touched with your hands or heard echo in your ears. But why would we use the word virtual in the first place instead of imaginary or something like that? Well, the etym-online definition, excellent source of definitions, by the way, reminds us that at some point in the 15th century, the word took on the meaning of, well, let's just read it. It says, being something in essence or effect, though not actually or in fact. And this is from the mid-15th century, probably via the sense of something being capable of producing a certain effect. And that is essentially what we're looking for, the effect of being able to recall information that we've placed in a memory palace. And the memory palace is essentially a collection of locations. Now, it gets a little bit goofy because if you think about how the brain works or how we think the brain works, everything in your mind is already virtual. It is a virtual production cooked up by the various parts of your brain that help you navigate the world. So even if you make a memory palace based off of the room that I'm in now, if you were to come here and visit it and you saw it with your own eyes, it still would be a virtual reproduction of the space. Your brain is filtering out the bombardment of all kinds of information in order to help you be able to survive in the world. So at the end of the day, memory palaces are always already virtual, no matter what. There is no such thing as a quote-unquote real memory palace. By the same token, there is something about how that we can easily reduce cognitive load by using locations that are already in memory. So when we think about memory palaces that do not actually exist but are truly virtual in the sense of picking something that's going to help us remember something that we haven't seen with our very own eyes, we're talking about journeys based on fantasy locations in books, movies, video games, perhaps in VR programs and in paintings or paintings within paintings, as the case may be. But there's varying degrees because you have seen a painting, perhaps, that you're basing it on. You have seen a picture of the painting. You've seen the VR environment, etc. So at some point, we're always seeing it. So is there really any such thing as a virtual memory palace? We really ultimately mean a place that we haven't been. The brain hasn't spatially mapped it out by glancing at it and having made the first virtual version in the chemical bath of our brain. So it is a first virtual version that doesn't have a lived, embodied experience because you're not in the place. Now, why does all of this matter? Well, it matters relative to your ability to take on cognitive load, because the magic of the traditional memory palace is that there is almost no cognitive load. Your brain has memorized the location and the journeys that you can make through it on autopilot because there is some sort of one-to-one correspondence between space. This isn't my term. This is Stephen Kosselin's term in the case for mental imagery. And, there's all kinds of noodly things to say about that. The point is that if you look at a real estate website and then you build that journey, it may work for you very, very well based purely on a real estate website. You might do an online museum tour. I tried this before that I went to the Sistine Chapel. It didn't work. But when I actually did go to the Sistine Chapel, bang presto, very, very easy to turn that one area where you get to see Michelangelo's wonderful God and Adam up over your head. Oh, so much easier. And the thing is actually being there is just different than the pictures. It was just surprisingly real because I had been there. But in any case, you can find locations using Google Map or Google Earth, memory palaces provided by authors of memory training books, which we'll look at some examples of in a minute. And maybe, for example, you can look at some of the scientific studies. Tyson Yunkaporta and David Reeser had one about Aboriginal memory techniques, for example, and you can think through in that study what might be virtual and what isn't. But at the end of the day, there is a little bit of an element of that there. The key is that if you want to do this, then pick your battle and think deeply about what we're going to talk about today so that when the truly virtual memory palace is in play, you design it so that it will work. But before we get into the design elements that I'm going to share with you, let's talk about some specific examples of what might count as a virtual memory palace. Now, I've got here the book, The Mystic Arc, and I want to give you a little bit of a warning. Sometimes people, they watch a video where I mention a book or I make a whole video about a book, and they say, I got that book and it didn't help me at all. And I don't know that this book will help you at all. I don't know any book that I recommend will help you at all. But I would encourage you that if you're a serious student of the art of memory, to just get the books and read them. You know, there's a guy named Ramit Sethi, and he has said that he thinks of books not in terms of how many ideas they have, but how cool the ideas are. And so let's say this book cost, I don't know, $20 or something like that, and you got one idea out of it. Well, then it's a $20 idea. And, you know, we value things a little bit differently, but I found this book tremendously useful. And I made a whole video based on the different experiments that I was able to make out of the Mystic Arc. And you can watch my deep dive study, the experiments that I made. I probably haven't even begun to mine the value that's possible by rereading the book because, by the way, reading something once is not necessarily reading. You know, we sometimes have to be a little bit more generous to our minds and to authors and pick things up as we go. Anyway, that's a big speech, and I think it's an important one because 90 days, Metivier's razor, I do it. It's really important, and I don't even do it enough myself because I know that when I reread this book, I'm going to pick up something that I didn't pick up before, and then I'll do another case study, and it'll be better than the previous case study, and I would encourage you to do the same. And so spend the time rather than, you know, saying, the book didn't help me, and, you know, graffiti comments on the wall. Just go and read it again and do some more study and some more practice. It's called the art of memory. It's a technique. We practice it. And in order to improve our practice, we study. And I don't know which books will be useful for you, but I'm not going to stop recommending them. And, you know, I myself sometimes am disappointed with books that I get, but then I stop myself. Stop. It's just a book. And I will read it again, hopefully, one day, given time, because what didn't work on Monday may have more to do with Monday than the book. And Tuesday is a different day. Anyway, as I said, to give Hugh of St. Victor's technique a try, as I understood it, both from the Mystic Arc and from his book Didascalicon and some other things that he talks about how to study properly and so forth, I made a deep dive walkthrough for you, and it is something that enriched my life to go through. And I would encourage you to also actually implement what you read. Don't just read and think, oh, I didn't get it. There's nothing to get here. The art of memory is a practice. Okay, so that's one example. Other practices involving using imaginary spaces that you may not have visited. Timothy Moser, for example, his work on virtual memory palaces for Spanish. He was on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast years ago, and some people have said that they really like what he does. He has a bee that you follow around and so forth. I don't actually have that book, but I remember having some digital versions of it back in the day. There's Memorize the Stoics. by Kevin Vost. And he makes memory palaces for you, and they're virtual in the sense that nobody's ever been to them. They're drawings of rooms. Giordano Bruno has the idea of the infinite memory palace technique. Now, I don't think any of us really understand exactly what Bruno is talking about, but the implications there are fairly clear, and I've talked about them in the Chaos Memory Palace of Giordano Bruno. Robert Flood, possibly. He had the theater of the world technique, so to speak. Although I think it's only possible that he meant for his drawings to be used as memory palaces. He says some things in his writing that suggest that he actually meant you to go to a theater, watch a Shakespeare play or something like that, and then actually use the theater and the characters that you saw there. Real memory palace, not use his drawings of the theater. By the same token, Flood has these geometric forms that you see in the illustrations, and these could be portals or wormholes to other memory palaces. There's also the suggestion in his work that pairing certain kinds of words to certain kinds of images might help with the memorization of grammatical rules or grammatical structures. It's kind of difficult to tell, but no matter what Flood intended, you can certainly use his illustration as a virtual memory palace. And you can also imagine the locations behind the open doors in his drawing. You can think of where they might lead or what spaces might be behind there after using the drawing itself. And to a certain extent, I have done this. This is a memory palace that I drew of a friend's house, Patrick, and he had a garage, and in this image, I have a little bit of a dotted line there of my memory palace drawing. I never went inside that garage, but I still used its four corners and extended the memory palace in that way. And it worked pretty good. But notice, it was part of a real memory palace, and it was just four corners. But let's think this through in terms of the cognitive load. There isn't much here because 4 is what I'm remembering. 4 corners. If I was more advanced in my practice the way I am now, I probably would have used the walls and the corners. So it would have been 8 stations inside of there. The difference here is that what I'm remembering is just a simple number based on what I think of as the eternal stations. Corners and walls are eternal stations. Not that they're really eternal, but if the building is destroyed, I'm going to have a memory of what I did there, and it's going to be very, very simple. The cognitive load is reduced down to 4 corners. Or, as I sometimes now do, 4 corners and 4 walls, which makes for 8. That's an interesting number for eternal station, isn't it? Now, the whole thing is why is this different? Well, it reduces the cognitive load down to the minimum degree. This is quite different than what Kevin Vost is doing in Memorize the Stoics. So what he's doing is he's providing a drawing, which has to be memorized, and then he's providing a journey, which has to be memorized, which is linked to objects that have to be memorized. So you have a door, a carpet, a window, a framed portrait, etc. Now, I memorized a line from Seneca that I found in this book. Nihil minus est omnis occupati quam vivere. We busy our stuff with the busy stuff of life when, we could just be doing things that are actually substantial and meaningful. So I didn't use Kevin Vost's suggested memory palace because it's a heck of a lot faster to use the magnetic memory method. Nihil minus est. It starts with N, so I rock on over to my friend Nick's house, and I just use his place much, much faster than looking at a drawing, memorizing the drawing, memorizing the journey that is suggested by the author. Look, no shade to the dearly departed Kevin Vost. The whole point is that think about the real game you're playing here. And if it works for you, fantastic. I have no qualm with that. The only thing is that, you've got to be radically honest about what you're really doing here, what you're spending your time on when there's rooms all over the place. So I think it's cool what Timothy Moser does. He has a fairground. He has a bee named Joel. You can follow Joel all around while you're learning Spanish and so forth. But you have to learn that the bee's name is Joel. Now, there's some good reasons for that. Let's go further into this because there's lots of interesting issues, and I think it's all good to experiment with. You have the Von cube. Now, the Von cube has different manifestations. This one's for music theory, and basically what you're doing is creating a layered square. So it has a kind of eternal station flair to it, but you got to learn certain principles, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The Von cube is a very interesting thing. I think I don't think there are historical precedents to the cube and dividing up rooms in particular ways. So I guess it comes down to, well, I named Metivier's razor after me, so he can name the ancient cube idea after him, and so on and so forth. The whole point is his books really are best enabled when you get the DVD, or at least this book is, because it helps animate the key signatures and how key signatures work in music and so forth. So I would suggest that if you do get this, make sure that you get the DVD. My friend John and I, we talk about this in some related ways with music on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. We also get into heavy metal and all that sort of stuff. So if you're interested in music memory related topics, you want to check that out. And he has even more sort of virtual memory palace ideas, if I recall, related to the fretboard, and we go through making fretboard memory palaces, I believe. You can look at Ed Cook's Remember. That's another example of, at least in my memory, it's an example of authors supplying a kind of memory palace for you. Lewis Smile, for example. Some people have really taken to Lewis Smile's book. We heard on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast from Alicia Crosby. She was 10 at the time, I believe, and she was on there with her father, and we were talking about having used the Lewis Smile book. Alicia also talks about how she used Minecraft for memory palaces. Not a book of Minecraft, I don't think, but the actual game or software itself. I've never actually played Minecraft. I just have this book here. But I've seen videos, and you have people with the sounds of them walking through the space. Clop, 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 clop. And that's interesting. I don't think it would help my own practice to hear that while I'm just memorizing very directly and quickly and recalling as quickly as possible. But it's interesting. And, if you have the book version, I guess you could go, I'm moving here, I'm moving here, I'm moving here, I'm moving here. But notice that that's all adding cognitive load. It is activity that is not necessarily going to lead to accomplishment. But that interview is there for you. It's really cool to hear someone at such a young age with her father. Very, very inspiring. So make sure you check that episode out if you haven't heard it before. Speaking of which, I'm starting to upload episodes that are audio only onto the Magnetic Memory Method podcast YouTube channel. If you aren't subscribed to it, get subscribed to it. I'll put a linky-loo up on the screen for you where you can go on over and do that. And there's some material there that's not on this channel and won't be. And I think you're going to love it if you love listening to auditory podcasts only. Now, in order to get the most out of the cognitive demands that memory palaces based on locations that you've never been with your own eyes, let's go through some things. And as you go through the steps that I'm going to share with you now, remember that you have to experiment. You have to experiment on your own, in quiet, in silence, in peach. Practice encoding at calm hours. A lot of people, they are distracted. They don't get any traction with the memory techniques, not only because they don't use it for long enough, Metivier's razor, but they're also not practicing it the way that Hugh of St. Victor would have said, would have suggested, and I believe that he does in Didascalicon. He was teaching at a time when people still read out loud a lot, and you still needed to have some reflection on what you were doing. You needed silence. And he says there, omnium expedendorum prima esse sapientia in qua perfecti boni forma consistit. Choose wisdom above all things, because in the choice of wisdom is goodness itself. So, choose some quiet, peach, practice encoding at calm hours. All right, if you're just starting with this, here's one thing that you can do. Whether it's from a movie, a real estate website, or something that you remember from a source. If you can get the source and screenshot it, then you can actually build your journey using the tools that most computers have. So you can label the journey on the screen. That can help your mind remember the journey with the least amount of cognitive load because you're not doing mental rotation. If you can't see images in your mind, if you have aphantasia and so forth, this is obviously going to be really, really critical. I've been thinking about this quite a bit because I think it would be fun at least once in my career, because you only do live once, if I create some virtual memory palaces for people. So this is Flyboy, the first book in the Memory Detective series. I'm sorry it's taking me so long to get Vitamin X done, part 2. But at the end of Vitamin X, Cafe Mnemonic comes into being. Sorry for the spoiler alert, but Cafe Mnemonic is not just part of the story, but is a virtual memory palace that Rob and Ambro have helped me create, and thank you both. And it's going to come into use in the future. And what you can do is look at it, screenshot it, and make your own journey through it. And part of the idea here is that it's divided into different sections. So you have a music section, you have poetry, you have a section for your own autobiographical matters, you have anatomy, you have chemistry, you have music. Now, those may not be your concerns, but you can make the different areas for your concerns. And then part of the idea is there'll be little secret entrances and little portals, and some of those are already in the drawing now. And you can just get started now, even if you haven't read Flyboy, even if you never read Vitamin X or the other installments yet to come. But man, you're going to have a lot more fun if you do, especially if you join us for one of the live-action memory detective games when I get around to the next one, which of course you will be notified about when you are subscribed. So if you're not, get subscribed, hit that thumbs up for the love of memory. But the reason why that I divided this particular memory palace in this way is as an experiment also for myself to grow my own strength. Because as I said, even though the cognitive load is much, much higher, it makes using memory palaces based on real locations much stronger. And one of the people who has influenced me on this a little bit is John Graham. And he talks about chaos training. And, it's kind of like putting on a heavy backpack when you're doing push-ups. You actually increase the challenge by making it harder and harder and harder. And that's ultimately, again, why I think that virtual memory palaces are so powerful. Now, you can also look up real places in the world that you haven't visited. So I've been to Rome, but for some reason, I don't know why, I didn't know when I was in Rome that there's a place called Keats Shelley House. Now, I really like Keats, and I really like Shelley, and I just, whatever. So I found out, and then I made a screenshot of what it looks like in there, and then I labeled the memory palace so you can see what I mean. And my journey method may be different than yours. I explain the reasons why I make journeys this way in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass. But the idea is you want to think, like, what's going to work for me? How many stations are going to make sense inside of this memory palace? And then, of course, what is it that you're going to memorize in there? Now, if it's in this particular location, memorize, some Keats. Oh, for a draft of vintage that had delved. Oh, well, I haven't quite finished, and it's delved a deep age in the long delft, or something like this. Bubbles winking at the brim. That's later on in the whole thing. But here's the thing, and I'm sharing this with you very raw. And, I made a mistake. Because of course I made a mistake. I've never been there. I'm trying to do it inside of this imaginary memory palace. Oh, for a draft of vintage that hath delved a deep age in the like, it just falls apart so easily in a way that it would not if I just went to Rome and went into the place and could actually refer to it in my mind. At least that's my experience with these things. Oh, but what a beautiful poem! My God, what a beautiful poem! Such a glorious poem. Now, to analyze my own mistakes here, one of the problems when I was doing this is maybe the locations are too close together. In the real world, that would not be a problem at all. But in the imaginary world, I have to recall the place I've never been, and I have to recall these little stars in the constellation that effectively do not exist. They're not in any space at all. They're in a space that's in a space that's in a space. You know what I'm saying? They're in a browser, which then in the browser is a photograph that's surrounded by text and screens, and then that photograph now has the mental image of little numbers that I've labeled using Photoshop which is now another screen within a screen. All this stuff is in memory. I think this is why part of it works the way that it does. It increases all this cognitive load. The one-to-one correspondence between a space in the world and a space that's encoded through spatial memory in the mind is diluted somehow. But in any case, it might not be for you. And I have to think more, well, how could I make that line work so that I don't drop words and I don't have to skip ahead and so forth? And that may be a thing. So when you do it, you may not want it to be as compressed as I have it on this example that I've made for you of this particular location. Now, what about memory palaces based on novels? Well, I've done this. The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco and Misery, right? Now here, they've got movies attached to them, both of them. So I'm really thinking about the movie more than the novel. And maybe Lord of the Rings and the maps and so forth, you could try. I just looked at that and I thought, man, that's a mishmash because the movies make it look this way and then here's the way it is, the map on the page, and then when I'm reading, I'm not really thinking about where they're progressing through things, and I'm not looking back and forth at the map and so forth. But if I was going to do that kind of thing, I would draw it out. Just as I would draw out a real location, even if I was going to incorporate things that I had never seen in terms of eternal stations, I would draw out these journeys. And that's what I did with The Name of the Rose, and that's what I did with Misery. So I had both novel and movie in mind at the same time while developing these locations for memorizing information. So are they really virtual? Well, they're virtual in the sense that those locations are sets in movies. So it's an infinite regress, this idea of the virtual memory palace. But if you want to know more about using novels as memory palaces, I have a whole video all about that for you, so we can go into deeper depth about that. The point really that you're wanting to consider is, what do I want to use? So is it Homer Simpson's house? It's an animation, right? Super virtual. Or is it a sitcom? I used to use the living room in Three's Company when I was experimenting, and in the same sense that I sort of invented what the inside of this garage looks like, I invented what some of the bedrooms and the bathroom looked like. I think in one episode maybe of Three's Company you ever see inside of one of those rooms. And still, it's virtual, it's a set, it's created, right? And it does, in my experience, increase the cognitive load, and therefore it decreases the viability of using the technique for any serious amount of learning. But it does give you, in the John Graham sense, chaos training. It makes it stronger on your mind, and it improves the use of real memory techniques. Now let's see. We've got real estate websites. We've got garages that we've never seen. We've got novels. We've got movies. What about video games? Well, the same principles are going to apply. You want to assign clear and easy journeys to follow. When I've made video game memory palaces, I have preferred simple platform games like Donkey Kong and Pac-Man. I prefer the simplest possible game that lets me see the entire journey at a glance, all the possible stations at a glance. In the same way that, I can look in a room and, I've basically got this constellation in my mind where the stars are, and I don't have to think about them at all, really, because they're just following this simple path that's already in memory. I don't have to memorize. And I try to use the rule of threes. So if it's Donkey Kong, I could have a Zeno's paradox kind of thing. Well, Donkey Kong, or Mario, he's never going to ever reach that barrel because half of a half is still half, and then there's a half of that half, which is then half. So, if you don't know Zeno's arrow, that paradox where the arrow can never reach its target because there's always a halfway point, and then there's a halfway point of the halfway point of the halfway point. No. It's just, here's the platform that Mario is running along, 1, 2, 3, right? That is best, rule of threes, because numbers reduce the cognitive load. But you have to count the platforms. How many platforms? Which level are we going to use? Well, what if we use that? Like, it can just get a lot of cognitive load, right? So back to the front, as Metallica likes to say, draw it out. Draw out whatever you're going to do. Make a final statement. You got 5 platforms. You're going to have 3 on each. 5 times 3, bang presto, you've got your journey, and work with it. start to build that skill, unless you really want super chaos. The same temptation would happen in something like Pac-Man. Well, should I turn every pellet into a station in my memory palace, or should I just use the corners and the walls? Less is more. No matter what source you're choosing for your memory palaces, you're going to need to experiment, whether they're real ones or imaginary ones. First-person shooter games, people have said that they have used vast expanses of space, and they remember the journeys because they've spent so much time in those games. But when I asked them on the podcast to, lay out the information that they've memorized using this, crickets. And I don't think they're ever going to come. So you want to really think about the difference between what people say and what people do. And, I think things fall apart for a lot of people, not just me, when they're using imaginary memory palaces. But some people just really love the activity of the technique rather than the accomplishment of the technique. I love the accomplishment. So I have done lots of experiments. They have improved my skills. I know I'm repeating myself, but at the end of the day, the reason why I'm going into such depth is to help you decide whether you want to really get into every pellet in a Pac-Man video game, as opposed to every square on a chessboard, because a chessboard is another kind of imaginary memory palace that we could use. Now, spoiler alert, there's chess in Flyboy. Flyboy is in a series. Everything I'm doing in Flyboy is a setup for what happens throughout the rest of the series. So there's chessboards there. And that might be part of the Cafe Mnemonic memory palace that is virtual, that you may or may not want to use, perhaps as part of an upcoming game. The point is that the chessboard is not going to be free from cognitive load. You'd have to have basic knowledge, for example, of how many squares are on the board if you're going to use every square. And then you'd have to pick a starting point, and you'd have to remember what starting point you were going to pick. So in my experience using imaginary chessboards, it's cool to have a bookshelf in a memory palace where there's a chessboard and then use the chessboard itself. What works best is the four corners. Bang presto, done. It's additional 4 stations. Cool. Be happy with it, even though there's a lot of things. Now, it also has to do with how much information you're going to place on these little micro stations. Blowing them up in my mind helps a little, but it winds up requiring more mental energy than it's ultimately worth. So less is more, and also, what is the information that you're going to do? If it's going to be some beautiful poetry, then often you need a little bit more space, because also you want the kind of rhythm to come along with it as well once it's in your long-term memory. And something about the speed of implementation, I think, really helps that, because you're getting the dopamine spikes of accomplishment, real accomplishment. So if I think of a comparative example, if there be nothing new but that which is hath been before, how are our brains beguiled? That's Shakespeare, Sonnet 59. And that's actually in this building that I'm in. And it's just boom, ba ba boom, ba ba boom, ba ba boom. And it was very fast to memorize that. And it has its own challenges, because there's that and there, and then there's how R, like these 2 different versions of R, have to account for that sort of stuff. But it's so much easier to account for, simply because able to use the solid foundation of a real memory palace to base this on. So there are no chessboards, there's no video games, there's no paintings inside of paintings, there's no Bruno-esque infinite memory palaces. What I'm trying to say, though, is that you want to optimize at the end of the day for recall rehearsal. Recall rehearsal is how we use the memory palace technique to get information into long-term memory. And that is covered in other videos. I will not get into it now, but no matter what, long-term memory, unfortunately, does require some repetition. The question is how much repetition. And so I recommend that whatever you do, optimize so that it's easy to use the recall, rehearsal, spaced repetition patterns. That's going to lead to long-term retention of the target information as quickly as possible. I remember when one of my students, Adolfo, he was so excited to use his VR headset and to make memory palaces out of them, or to use provided virtual environments as memory palaces. And he was so convinced it was going to be the game changer. And he's a real serious student of the art of memory. I mean, he has followed things that have come up in the magnetic memory method world and through his own independent study to the nth degree. I mean, he's got junk food restaurants as a category in his memory palace networks. And that is super cool to really narrow down, crank down to that level of specificity. And so there was a lot of excitement about the VR helmet. But it was a week, maybe a little more than a week, before he sent me a video of what he was seeing and a big complaint about how seasick the experience made him. And I remember seeing this video, and it's just like bounce, 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 bounce. And, don't get me wrong. It may be that it's just the greatest thing since sliced bread for you. And I can see that you can obviously use a VR helmet in conjunction with the art of memory and the memory palace technique. But can you? I mean, the University of York has listed this doctoral position for people interested in investigating the relationship between digital environments and memory. It seems to be closed now, but I'd reached out for an interview on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast with the person behind it, Dr. Aidan Horner. And, I'm not exactly heartbroken necessarily, but I was just like, what do you mean? This is the greatest thing. Why can't we talk about it on the podcast? But he didn't have the time, I guess. Or maybe, I don't know. But at the end of the day, the position is closed. I don't know if it got filled or not. But we are going to learn something very big from him, because he makes a point that we don't have an account of how spatial structure affects memory. I think Kostlin has some decent ideas there. Some people have said that he's quite controversial on the notion of spatial memory and this idea, the case for mental imagery that he makes. And that's the whole point, though. Nothing's decided. And even if it gets decided, real science does not end. Always has to be tested. Doubt. We've got to avoid our confirmation biases, etc. We need to have that Popper-esque falsifiability principle. And as Popper would point out, even falsifiability has to be surrendered to the principle of falsifiability. So without an account for how the brain actually deals with space, how it remembers space, the ability to build spatial environments that would optimally boost your ability to learn using this technique is quite in question. I'm not exactly sure that the connection I want to draw here is valid, but Jaron Lanier has discussed something similar in These Limitations, I believe, in Dawn of the New Everything, which is a book I think everybody who's interested in computation, in spatial memory, in memory as such, really should read. Even though it's dated now, in my memory, it's still very, very relevant. Also because he has face blindness, and he talks about that a little bit. But there's an issue that I'll admit, I don't know that I fully understand it, but it has to do with the uncanny valley, and it has to do with where things are positioned in space relative to interfaces, and how that sort of challenges the brain's ability to track space. So that's a place to look. Additionally, there's a research paper that seems to support exactly what I have been suggesting all along. Your mind has to track both the invented environment and the target information in the virtual memory palace. Now, there's another research paper that you might want to check out that's called The Role of Spatial Boundaries in Shaping Long-Term Event Representations. And I believe this also confirms what I've been saying all along about how that you have to track two things at once when you use virtual memory palaces. The cognitive load is so much higher. Not only that, but we should take into consideration the response to, let's say, Apple's Vision Pro. Now, it was generally not favorable, except perhaps when people changed the meaning of the term memory palace. Alex Colum did this on LinkedIn in a post that only partially reflects how this technique works. You can read it for yourself and make your own decisions, but I think this is changing the idea of what a memory palace is. The people behind Marble Mind also did this. The Marble Mind Palace, they changed its meaning to anchoring exhibits in a similar way. So The idea, and this comes up in the Cologne thing, is that I remember where I placed documents in space on my virtual walls in the memory palace. Well, with Apple Pro, it's not even clear that it's virtual. It's a virtual layer, augmented reality, over the space. And now you remember where you put certain interfaces, certain screens, windows, etc. Well, yes, that is, I guess, the memory palace, but it's not the memory palace for learning, right? It's something different. So I think we would better be served to use a different name for that. I'm not the terminology police, of course, and things will go the way that they go, but you can see something there that is not the thing. It's not Genshi Genbutsu, as they say in Japanese. Go to the real place, do the real thing. Oh, you remember where your file was because you placed it on a wall while wearing this nausea-inducing mask. Right on, buddy. Like, I mean, wouldn't it be better to just remember where you put the thing without having to have a mask and an interface and screens within screens within screens within screens? I'm ultimately just not convinced that this is going anywhere, even if it triggers some recall of what you were doing in the past with documents for your work. I mean, yes, that's a good thing, but it's all this rigmarole you have to go through, making sure your battery is well charged, making sure that you got the thing on your head, and then all of this haptic stuff with your hands. And the Marble Mind Palace video showcasing the software, well, it shows the same shakiness that Adolfo complained about and ultimately made him explain, Anthony, you're right, traditional memory palaces are better, period. That was his words, not mine. And not just for learning goals. Just in general, it would be so fantastic if we could just remember without having to place something in between us, because there's already all kinds of Zeno arrow, infinite half of half of half of half between us and the thing, unless we do the Giordano Bruno-esque kind of shtick and we realize that we are coming into being as all reality comes into being along with us. I mean, that's a nice thought. I don't know if it's true or not, but it makes me feel so good and cuddly inside. Anyway, I agree with Dr. Horner that a proper thesis about how spatial memory works, doesn't work, it isn't there yet. And there's probably a long way to go before VR is going to provide an option that is faster and more reliable for the serious mnemonist. And I think at best what it will do is give you some chaos training, give you a backpack, a battery backpack to carry on your back. And that's what it'll do. It'll strengthen your skills with the traditional memory technique. And, scientists admit that they still don't fully understand why the traditional memory palace works. There's an article that came out recently about it, challenging the idea that you need to see anything at all, which I've challenged since the beginning of my career. My very first book talks about how I had IDD, information deficit disorder. I was told that when I was in grade 5, okay? And we don't need to see things in our mind. We don't need a visual environment in order to use the memory palace technique. I have known people who are not sighted who can use their own arm to track distances and remember things. Gerard Cousins was on the podcast. He was talking about this. Jerome in Flyboy is based on that idea. Jerome is the world's only blind memory competitor champion who smashes everybody else out of the park because he gets it. Doesn't have to do with seeing in the mind. It's always already virtual. Virtual all the way down. In my personal experience, in my discussions with memory expert Lynn Kelly, who identifies as aphantasic, not having a mind's eye, she just simply uses the technique, follows the descriptions in the ancient books, gets it done, Genshi Genbutsu, go to the real place, do the real thing. So VR, cool, experiment wildly. I hope you don't get seasickness like Adolfo did, but commit to it, for 90 days minimum if you're going to try it before you say, well, it doesn't work unless, you don't want to be seasick, because I totally commend not being seasick. I don't think that goes away if we look at some of the things about some of the recent helmets, semi-helmets, HUDs that people have been wearing. It didn't last very long. I mean, I studied Sistema, the martial art, for a while. Situational awareness is so valuable, and it's a bit of a tragedy that more people don't have it. But you're definitely reducing your situational awareness if you're going to walk around with that kind of stuff on your head, certainly when the traditional memory palace is here for you with maximum payoff in minimum time so that you can recall the knowledge that you want to recall reliably. So should you use a virtual memory palace or a VR helmet? Absolutely yes. Experiment like crazy. I've had VR helmets on, and my critical points are critical from experience as a person devoted to exploration, as a person who is convinced that falsifiability must itself be falsifiable, and to encourage you to have open inquiry so long as it is charitable and so long as it follows the basic idea behind Metivier's razor. Spend enough time doing it, unless it makes you ill. Then don't do it, because you don't want to be seasick all the time. But I've generally improved my practice with these techniques tremendously. It's stretched my imagination. It's made my computational thinking something it never used to be. And at the end of the day, it does reveal this fundamental mystery. Isn't it always already virtual? What is it about being in the real space that causes the brain to operate with it differently when that real space is, quote unquote, inherently virtual? So part of the beauty of the art of memory is to get a glimpse at the game behind the game, so to speak. What's really going on? If there is something true about what memory is, well, are there really levels to reality? I believe the art of memory is the way to treat it like a game, at least some of the time, to gamify everything, even if you're not really playing a game, and to be more present in the world. And that's part of why I work the way that I work, and it's why I run the experiments that I run, such as the one with Noah's Ark and just memorizing some of Hugh of St. Victor in Latin. Amazing what it did for my brain, strengthening it. Each and every word memorized strengthens and strengthens. And then there are affinity techniques to explore as well, such as mind mapping, combining mind mapping with memory palaces, the memory wheel, trying to use the memory wheel as a memory palace, and so on and so on. Those are topics that I've talked about a ton already and will talk about more in the future. Please be subscribed. Hit that thumbs up so that this project will still be there when the time comes to talk about those topics more and more and more. And if you haven't gotten the free course at magneticmemorymethod.com/YT, grab it. It's going to give you 4 videos that walk you through things. I love to see your homework, and it's amazing how much that I've received over the years. So keep it coming. That's magneticmemorymethod.com/YT. Now, I wanted to share one last thing with you before you go. It takes action. You have to explore it. Metivier's razor, boom, 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 all the way down. But as you continue experimenting, in my journey, I can share with you this. Use things that are really, really prominent in your mind, and be happy with less is more. So there's a phrase in Latin. It's just a couple of words. Solvitur ambulando. It is solved by walking. Now, I've got a YouTube video where I talk about this, and you can check it out. And I just thought of a basic scene from Breaking Bad, right? And I was happy with just that one scene to use it as part of a virtual memory palace for just 2 words, right? But cool. And it really, really helped it take hold very, very quickly. You know, I think the whole art of memory is often misunderstood. It's about better memory. It's about memorizing things faster, getting it into long-term memory faster. It's not about memorizing everything. Now, I know people would like that to be the case, and there are ideas in the Renaissance texts where people talked about remembering everything. But I've read between the lines of those texts, and I think that they actually are saying something a little bit more nuanced, a little bit different. And I covered that in my video, The Chaos Memory Palace of Giordano Bruno. And I would really encourage you to watch it if you are stuck in that almost Faust-esque wish to know it all. because I think they warned us against that, even though they did think that you could remember massive amounts of information, and you can. But one thing that I would encourage you to do is just be satisfied with less is more, because there's a lot more information in less than you might think due to principles of recursion and so forth. I won't get into that now, information theory, Zipf's law, all of that. But at the end of the day, if you look into it, you will be released from a lot of stress and pressure. I'm confident of it. Okay, so that's one thing. Less is more. The other thing is really, really follow as much as you can, at least in the beginning, or if you're struggling. I mean, if you can just nail this on fantasy locations that you make up on your own, cool. I really admire that. I tried making up fantasy locations on my own, and I got a certain distance, but they fall apart. So I had imaginary trains and so forth. And when I was younger, it worked a lot better. But as I get older, it doesn't work nearly as well. So maybe some of the things that I suggest are based on on that. But I'm going to keep going because I just love to remember stuff, and less is more is really, really important. But fantasy trains, having cars and moving from one to the other, I have to remember, like, which car am I in and all this sort of stuff. So it's just too much. But what has worked is to have very, very specific, solid references. So, in Batman, one of the Batman movies with Christian Bale, they're in this sort of underground parking garage, or I don't know where it is, but it's all lit up, nice white lights and so forth. Well, I thought of that. And there's a Berlin memory palace on Feuerstrasse in Schöneberg. And I lived there, and I used that memory palace. I memorized a poem in there. It was filled with mingled cream and amber, I will raise this glass again. Such hilarious visions clamber through the chambers of my brain. Quaintest thoughts and queerest fancies come to life and fade away. What care I how time passes? I am drinking ale today. I think that's Edgar Allan Poe, or it's attributed to him. In any case, I think that's how it goes. And I thought, wow, it would be amazing to use this place for more stuff. So I thought about that Batman underground parking garage with all the lights, and Alfred and Bruce Wayne are in there, and they're talking about some stuff. And I was like, that's cool. That has eternal stations in my mind, because it's a square, essentially. And then I thought, it'd be cool to jam that thing inside of the Berlin Feuerstrasse apartment in Schöneberg. Hot damn, I'm going to do it. So then I thought, what would be a portal into this place? Now, at that time, I didn't have a chessboard anymore in that place, but what I did always have on my desk was a deck of ye old bicycle cards that I used in magic tricks. So what I did is I imagined that it was empty, and then I went inside, and inside of the bicycle deck of cards was Batman and that white parking garage sort of place in the movie. I don't remember which exact of the Batman movies that it's in. It doesn't really matter. It's prominent in my mind, and that is a principle that I would share with you. And then the bicycle card case, bicycle, B, Batman, all that sort of stuff, it was prominent on my mind and linked alphabetically. So that means there's much less to memorize, because B, bicycle, they go together. Like Ramalama, Lama, yippity ding dong. Is that how that goes in that song? In any case, you can do all kinds of things from there. You can change the color of the Batman room if you want to make more versions of the same thing. Increase cognitive load. Can you decrease the cognitive load? Sure, make the colors alphabetical, and then you have a hook that helps you remember the order that you're rotating through the different versions of the memory palaces that are inside the card box, inside the memory palace, and on and on and on. And we can do this, but you can also just use real memory palaces. This is ultimately what the magnetic memory method is all about. It's what I teach in the program. I have a video here on YouTube that is all about how to find memory palaces and make them as clear and direct as possible. But what I've hoped to express today is that I have benefited so much from these experiments. I do them less. My preference now is more and more to cleave to the tradition, especially as I work on saving my brain. Cognitive decline is real as you age, and I want to be able to use this technique as directly as possible to get the result, because activity can lead to accomplishment, but I need more and more accomplishment to be in the foreground, and I need fewer and fewer imaginary backgrounds You dig? That's what it's all about. And every experiment that I do, if I take on another one, I do my best. And it's hard. It's a difficult world. But I do my best to stick to Metivier's razor and put my mouth where my bicycle cards are. Thank you again for joining me. This is a wonderful delight. I hope I'm not overselling how cool the Vitamin X sequel to Flyboy is going to be, but I'm doing my best. I might fall flat on my face because it's really, really complicated. That's why I'm on version 6. But it's a lot of fun, and it has a lot to do with the virtual memory palace problem. It's got a Lucasa in it, and on and on. It's a bit over the top, really. And I'm trying to make it as readable as possible, even though the concepts are, I think, very, very challenging. And they're especially challenging because it all has to set up for the grand finale. Okay, the writers of Breaking Bad, I am not. But you only live once, so thank you again for being part of this, giving your time and attention to it. And remember, always, always remember, you can't learn from watching videos, at least not the art of memory. You have to study and practice. Put the ideas into practice. Implement. Genshi Genbutsu. Go to the real place. Do the real thing. Even if the real place is itself virtual, cooked up by the chemicals in your brain. Isn't that an exciting realization? I think it's the most exciting thing in the world. So thank you again. And until we have a chance to speak again, if you want, carry on and watch the imaginary memory palace method of Hugh of St. Victor. You'll learn a ton.